That myself, yeah. Okay.
Okej. God morgon. Hör ni mig? Yes. please take a seat. I think there is a seat for everyone. Yeah. Okay. Once again, god morgon, good morning, and welcome. My name is Ola Altero, and all other days of the week I am the Chief Executive of the Swedish Climate Policy Council. But this morning I will be moderator of this seminar on climate strategies and policies of a few important countries in the world. And the welcoming is for each of every one of you in the audience, but also for all of you following us on the live web stream. Welcome to you as well. Hello. And of course, a special welcome to our guests from our close comrades in fighting climate change, crossing the Baltic Sea or even the Atlantic or the vast Euro-Asian continent to be with us this morning. We are very glad that you have done so, and we're glad to welcome you to this one of these beautiful early summer's morning when the climate of these Nordic territories of the Earth is at its best, I would say. We might have been less rigorous about the idea of climate change in a November seminar, but today we are very happy with our climate. So this is a joint event by IVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Science, and NIB, the Nordic Investment Bank. So without further ado, I will leave the floor for an opening address, first from Tuula Teri, the CEO of IVA, and she will be followed by Thomas Wrangdahl, who is first Vice President of NIB, but also Head of Lending. Please, Tuula.
Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome also on my behalf to come to IVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. You almost get your tongue in knots, you know, with the long name, but we call ourselves IVA, so that will be easier to remember. And our mission in Sweden for almost 100 years now has been to kind of promote engineering and economic sciences and industrial development for the benefit of the society. So what we are doing, most of our activities, we kind of like to say that we are an autonomous or independent organization, and we base our activities on scientific facts. I think that's something that is quite important nowadays with all the alternative truths and fact resistance and things like that, you know, that we have organizations that really stand on a scientific basis. And so what we do in our everyday life is that we work with different kinds of analysis. We do analysis and we catalyze discussions like the one today on different societal questions. And we combine oftentimes in our discussions academics, businesses and politics, so that we can be sure that, you know, the scientific facts which are brought out into the discussions, they are also gradually brought to the industry and also to the political decision makers, which is of course how the society works. So we have about 1,000 fellows in Sweden and about almost 300 international fellows around the world. We also have a business council which has about 200, 230 companies that are also supporting us with not only with financial resources, but also very much their intellectual contributions, you know, to the discussions and planning of our activities. So when we look at these societal challenges, I think few come close, you know, to the threat of the ongoing climate change. I'm sure we can all agree on that. And I think that we will have to face this or solve this challenge so that we can still maintain our industrial vigor and without destroying the atmosphere, if you like. So the Swedish goal in the climate issues is to achieve zero net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2045 while maintaining the competitive industrial base. And so IVA as an organization has, or an academy has worked with issues of energy and electricity, I think almost all of the time that we have existed for about 100 years. And these are questions that are getting even more complex now with the climate change. So I predict that we will be working with these issues for the next 100 years as well. So some things, really require to be very persistent with your activities. And I think access to fossil-free energies is a competitive advantage of Sweden, but the electricity, of course, is not the only solution. So we're also focusing on bioenergy, which is based on our forest resources. We also have very efficient district heating systems, and our industrial expertise and our sort of acknowledged innovative capacity are examples of how sort of these Swedish assets that we are using to try to tackle and achieve the climate neutrality. So we are very, very happy to have you all here today to share your expertise and your commitment also to mitigating climate change. And I personally think that international collaboration is really the key, probably the only way that we can think that we can actually solve this gigantic challenge that we are facing. So I wish you welcome once more, and I wish that you have a great seminar. Thank you.
Yes, from Nordic Investment Bank, I also would like you to feel very welcome to this important seminar. You will hear much more about Nordic Investment Bank later this morning. But briefly, we are some 200 people in Helsinki, in Finland, and we have a portfolio of some 18 billion euro. And that portfolio is dedicated to the two things that Tula spoke about here, environmental projects, but also as we see it in the Nordic Investment Bank and the goals we have received from ultimately from our governors and our board to work with productivity. In Nordic Investment Bank, we think those two goals goes often very good hand in hand. And we have dedicated ways of promoting those type of activities, and you will hear more about that. We also work quite a lot internationally, so outside our membership countries. Our membership countries are the Nordic and Baltic countries, so that is going to be 8 countries if you count them. And we do that in projects that are positive and have positive effects, which we measure quite efficiently and with effective measures. And we do that then to promote projects that also have a connection to the Nordic-Baltic area. So we go to different seminars, not only in the Nordic-Baltic, but also outside. And I'm always, slightly surprised but impressed what all the other countries are doing here. So I really look forward to listen to our colleagues from the other nations here. We do have some direct cooperation and some projects in those countries, but we'll come back to that maybe a little bit during the panel debate that I will be part of also. So with those words, very welcome, and as you, I'm very much looking forward to listen to the speakers here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tula and Thomas, for framing this morning, and most of all for arranging this seminar, which I think promises to be able to take us out of what sometimes tends to be a bit narrow national perspective of something that is truly a global challenge that we share with many others. Next on stage has had a long career in senior positions in the Swedish iron and steel industry. And she herself is, like me, hardened in somewhere in the true north, in the land of the midnight sun. Even if nowadays she is actually the county governor of Östergötland, just south of the capital region of Stockholm. But today, foremost in the position of chairperson in the steering group of the new EVA project, Climate Crossroads. So that she will now introduce. Welcome, Elisabeth Nilsson. Stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Ola. And I also wish to say welcome to everyone that is here today, and I'm really happy that so many people are here, and that is a mark of the interest that is in the society for this really very, very important issue of climate change. And to be the chairman of this project, Climate Crossroads, within the EVA group is really, for me, very, very interesting. I was happy when I got the question to be the chairman. And I'm, of course, a member of EVA since more than 10 years ago. There is a goal for Sweden regarding climate change that we should have zero emissions by 2045. It's easy to set a goal for everyone. The problem is how to reach this very challenging goal. Ja, jag kommer dit. Just det, nästa bild, ja. Så, precis. And the purpose of this project is not to put any new goal. It's really how to reach these goals. What type of alternatives are there? And how to find ways that also improve the competitiveness of our country. We're also aware in our project that we cannot walk alone. Everybody is influencing each other's. What we do have an impact on what other countries are doing and have to do, and what they do have an impact on us. And we can make decisions and take measures that have a negative effect of others, so we really have to have an awareness and really work together to solve this really challenging issue. We're a fortunate country. We have a population around 10 million people. We have a lot of area, water, power plants, a lot of forest, but still we cannot solve all the problem by ourselves. Then we can understand others have more challenging situation than we have. And when we should discuss our crossroads, we have to understand what is happening around us, what can we learn, what can others contribute with, and what can we do. And that's why we arranged this seminar. We have an agreement with zero emissions 2045 and also negative emissions after that. And to be able to reach that, a lot of technical issues have to be solved. And this agreement is, there are 7 out of 8 parties in the parliament that stands behind this very tough goal. And but how to reach this? There are no one-way solutions. And we'll highlight various options from different type of perspectives to find out the best way to reach these goals, or the best ways. And therefore it's interesting to listen to what are you doing in many other countries today. There are some project goals. What we should do is to prepare an action plan for Sweden to achieve climate neutrality and increase competitiveness by 2045. This project will also make a consequence impact analysis of the activities that are going on and planned to reduce emissions on greenhouse gases. And also we have to identify are there conflicts with other interests, and how can we find opportunities to improve the situation. And it's self-evident that if we do one thing, that will have an impact on other things. And some things can look very interesting, but if you look deeper, you can find conflict of interest with other important goals, like the 2030 goals for the whole planet. Another issue is we have to analyze how our developments will have an impact on other countries, what effect your and other countries' policies will have on us. We cannot just look at our own system. It's really too small. And one very important thing for us is, like many other projects within the EVA, is to have an impact on the policies made by our politicians in the parliaments and our government, and to have a dialogue with those people, because they are the most important people for the future. Do we organize this work? We have, of course, a project organization. We have a steering committee with a broad participation from different parts of society. And it is business sector, academy, NGOs, authorities, transports, etc. We also dialogue with another academy to get involvement with the foresting, agriculture sector. And this project engaged around 100 or maybe more than 100 people. So there is a lot of knowledge in those different type of working groups. And the working groups will handle issues like agriculture, energy system, transport system, and industry system. But we cannot just work in sectors like this. We have to look at the whole society. And therefore we have a group looking at these societal issues, how to implement issues, what type of political measures are necessary to take, and how to make that happen, and what are the... there's also other opinions how to do and tackle this. So therefore this seminar is very important and for the project, and can be regarded as a part of the international reference group that we need to have. So I really encourage you, everybody, to give input to our project so we get the most out of this day and during the discussion in the smaller groups in the afternoon. And how do we look? A nice group of people. Not everybody is here, but it's a pleasant group to work with. They're very eager to deliver results to the politicians. And how long are we going to work, and what are we doing? We start now. The start has been this spring, approximately 2 months ago. And we started with industrial systems, transport system, energy system. But then we have a new part that very important is this analysis of the social perspective. We also involve the agriculture and food sector. Everybody's talking a lot about biofuel, but from where will it come? And what impact will that have on our society? And then the societal issues. It's not easy for any politician to take decisions that everybody will be against, at least in the short sight. So therefore, how to discuss these issues and what do we have to think of? And then we have to make a conclusion and to give the final results and communicate this, because communication is maybe the most important issue in the end. In EVA, we don't want the project just to stay within EVA. It should be really a part of the discussions in society. So therefore, thank you very much for that you are here, and for you that will participate here in the morning. We are eager to listen to what you have to present. Thank you.
Elisabeth. Vänta en sekund, ska jag få fråga dig en sak. Thank you, Elisabeth. You have yourself, just have one reflection, changed in your, I mean, you had a long career in the private sector and industry, and now you're in this public position and seeing society from a different position. Is there anything of those two perspectives that you especially bring into the project, or do you see it differently from the perspective you have nowadays than you had before?
I remember when we started to discuss climate issues, when I was working in SSAB, I was manager for the Department of Environment and working environmental issues in Oxelösund. That's one of the part of the SSAB groups.
Yeah.
And we had a meeting in our environmental council, and we talked with the technical director of SSAB that they talk about handling a system for carbon dioxide emission trade, and he said that it must be crazy.
Yeah.
And that was 20 years ago,
Yeah.
or more than 20 years ago. And I think I didn't myself really understood the consequences and what the trends were 20 years ago. I really didn't. Yeah. And I also worried how to solve this problem because of the complicated processes that are in the steel industry. Because today we have no alternative, but it's very interesting projects going on that I really think and hope they will solve these challenging issues. And the more you learn, you can look at results, you can read reports, you can see I'm born in the very north of Sweden. My father was a farmer, my brother has forests, etc. So I can really look what's happening, look at the statistics, read articles from other parts of the world, and it's really worrying what's happening. And then you look at the trends, you see the figures for the emission all around the world. You can see that still we are building carbon fired power plants. Yeah. And we have an economy that's growing, and people would like to buy their cars and travel more and eat more, etc., etc. So it's really necessary to find very interesting solutions, and we cannot just look like this. No. Because if we'd look like this in Sweden, in Europe, then you will have maybe greater problems in Indonesia and Brazil, etc. So therefore, to have an understanding of the whole system is necessary. And I'm interested in energy issues, industrial issues, transport, agriculture, and everything. So it fits me perfect.
Great. Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you. And we wish you all the best with this new started project. And I guess that is, maybe you gave us this first insight to bring along from this morning, that when we're facing all these tremendous challenges looking forward, it's sometimes good to reflect on, as you did 20 years ago, things that we couldn't even think about at that time. We are now moving ahead in a pace that we did not expect. So this morning we all have the privilege to lay down our daily burdens, our sometimes all too well rehearsed national debates or pet subjects, and just listen and learn from a few important countries and how they have taken on this challenge of drastically reducing greenhouse gas emissions and stabilize our global climate. This is, of course, as we already said, a global challenge, and we amazingly, considering the climate of world affairs these days, got a global consensus agreement, or consensus minus you all know who, which has a truly high ambition. But in this world, we are still dependent on national governments to make this ambition reality and to make it happen. Of course, then in close cooperation with industries and cities and regions and NGOs and all other stakeholders. And we are blessed to have very knowledgeable experts today. We'll share their views and insights from climate policies and low carbon transformations in China, Germany, United Kingdom, and Canada. And I should mention that some of them are more or less related to government institutions or parts of government, but none of them speak today as a representative or spokesperson of any government. On the contrary, we hope to get kind of your personal reflections, and I think we all learn best from both successes and challenges and shortcomings, and I hope we can have that kind of dialogue this morning. So then, are you ready for a global climate policy tour? Yeah, so let's start with our good neighbors in the south, the industrial engine of Europe, Germany. And I think there are few other persons better positioned than Dr. Carsten Rolle to give insights into the German climate strategies and the work you do. He's head of Department of Energy and Climate Policy at Bundesverband der Deutschen Industries, which is the German Federation of German Industries, Svenskt Näringsliv, I guess you would say. So, Carsten, please, the floor is yours, and welcome to share with us the picture from Germany.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ola, President Thierry, Mrs. Nielsen, distinguished audience. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I feel quite honored to share some of the experiences we did with maybe a similar study project for the last 2 years with you on climate pathways in Germany. The starting point for this project we did as Federation of German Industries, and you may ask, why does an industry organization deal with climate policy that much in detail, was the German government actually published a strategy, a climate policy strategy up to the year 2050 with similar reduction targets of 80 to 95% CO2 reduction up to 2050. And on top of that, with very precise sectorial targets for the year 2030 for transport, for housing, for industry, for energy. And that was, to some extent, a little bit of a wake-up call for some of our branches to deal a little bit more in depth with it, as they did it without an impact assessment. We tried to find a sort of fact base to discuss different policies on a common ground. And that was the exercise we did. As we say, the engineers, the technicians from our organization should be the one who actually implement all these technologies and who should know best about it. So the study project Climate Paths for Germany was not a usual project for our organization, for BDI. It was actually the biggest study project we did in its history. Why that? Not that much because of the price, but as it was really a long process of involving as much practitioners and technicians from all our member companies in that project, not only asking Boston Consulting Group and the Swiss Prognos AG to do some calculations on behalf of us, but really to organize a process that gives as much feedback as possible from those who are really doing the work, from the technicians. So we had almost 200 experts from industry involved in that process. We had 40 workshops on very many detailed issues in the different branches, in the different sectors, scientific board on that, to really make sure whatever we do in these scenarios, and should underline that it is really a scenario work, it is not a forecast or a prediction, it is really scenarios under certain circumstances to build up consistent future pictures, that this was really cross-checked. What are we doing? We start with very traditional, a reference path, the current policy scenario. With the current policies in place in Germany, if we freeze them in, how far would technological progress from today's perspective, as we believe it will happen, bring us up to the year 2050, CO2-wise? And then we will mirror these bottom-up scenario with the target scenario of government, 80 to 95%. That's the corridor they have defined. And we will do that in 2 scenario worlds. One scenario world that you might call the Paris world, where all of the world goes very much in line in terms of climate ambition, not only signing up for a Paris Agreement, but really very concrete in comparable CO2 prices in all industrialized and developing countries globally. So that is really the level playing field world. And another world, lack of global ambition, where Europe is going faster than the rest of the world. So you have to deal with these differences in the global level playing field. That makes a difference, especially for manufacturing industries in terms of competitiveness. Before we go into the results, it should be important to underline what is in these scenarios. And of course, there's a broad range of things you could vary, and then the results vary. So let me just pick a few of these assumptions. One, for industry, very important one at the very beginning is we put in perfect carbon leakage protection as a given, as an assumption at the very beginning, especially for this world where we do have different CO2 prices globally. That was, for industry, a very important starting point to really bring everyone on the table, that no one will be lost on the way, that this is a given. Second, we've moduled a sort of copper plate electricity-wise, so there's no bottlenecks in the German electricity grid that we obviously have today already, and that might even get worse. But in the year 2050, we believe, or we said that is not part of our analysis. We do have no bottlenecks. Third one is probably the most important one. We look at all the results from a bird's perspective, from an economic point of view, and not, as we did 10 years ago with McKinsey, from a decision maker's point of view. And there's, of course, a huge gap. What is economically feasible for the individual investor, the one who buys the car, who builds the house, who buys the machine, and what is economically feasible for a society in total? I'll come back to that, as this, of course, gives very important implications for the political framework conditions. There's a lot more in it. There's perfect regulation, right policy decision at the right time, and when I presented that to German politicians, they were laughing most loudly at that one, as it is quite clear, of course, this is all an ideal world, and you could think of even more hurdles, but I won't get into detail. Second, there's some price assumptions that are, of course, have a difference. That is interest rates, that's fossil oil prices, gas prices, and CO2 prices. That's why I show them here. In the one reference and the national scenarios, we have high oil prices and moderate CO2 prices, and in the other world, well, the Paris world, where demand for oil and gas is lower, obviously, oil prices are lower and CO2 prices are higher. That's the two scenario worlds we look at. Now, to come to the first result, where does the bottom-up scenarios bring us towards? With the current policies in place in Germany, we believe that reduction of GHG emissions compared to 1990 of 61% up to 2050 is possible. That's quite a figure, but still there is a gap between the bottom-up and the political targets, and everything which comes now is about how to fill this gap. What are the implications? Is that technologically feasible? Is that economically feasible? What does that mean for an economy? Don't get into the details, and the methodology now is, and you don't have to read that, we look at very many technologies one by one, look at the abatement cost of CO2, bring them in an order, and then fill the gap until we are at 80 or at 95%, and then look what is the economic implication of that. Look at the 80% path, and as said, we want to look into the sectorial and the 5 sectors. We have the housing sector as the 5th one, and what does it mean for them? The big balls on the left are the historical emissions for the different sectors in Germany in 1990, and the light one is in 2015. Then you see the current policy, the reference pathway in the second row, and in the third column it is the 80% path. What gets quite clear is whether it is the reference path or the 80% path, 60 or 80% is not 80% for every sector. There's sectors where abatement costs are lower, which is obviously the power sector and the building sector, the heating sector, where 80% for everyone means more or less 90% for those. And other sectors where it is more expensive, there's this transport and manufacturing industries, and it is as well agriculture sector where also there are not that many technologies. That's why it is not that easy. How does a world of 80% look like? And that should be Germany with several technologies. What you will discover if you look at these technologies, you know most of them. They're all there, more or less. So it is a lot more of renewable energies. It's basically the double of the generation capacity of wind and solar, of renewables as we have today in Germany. It is a replacement of coal by gas and by other energies, where it is still used. It is a lot more renovation of buildings, 50% more buildings being renovated efficiently year by year from today up to 2050. Every year, 1.7% of the buildings should be efficiently renovated. There's a lot of electrification in it, probably even more than I would have expected in the very beginning. 14 million heat pumps, 26 million electric vehicles. That's 2/3 of the passenger cars, of the newly bought passenger cars in Germany. There's a lot of efficiency in industry. And when it comes to industry, there's another use of the biomass, which we said will stay constant. That was given for us. We take the biomass demand of today, freeze it in, and then look how it could be used as efficient as possible. And if you do so, our recommendation is to use the biomass more in low and middle heat processes in industry, where it is more efficiently used, rather than in the power sector, in the housing sector, just for heating with lower efficiency rates. So that's the 80% world. Now let's have a look on the 95%, which German politicians also have in mind. 95% is different. It is a completely different world. It is not just 15 percentage points more, it is a different world. Why that? Well, first of all, the figures are different, obviously, and you see 95% for all sectors means basically 100% for several sectors, like the power sector, transport sector, building sector. There's nothing left for these sectors. It's complete decarbonization. There's hardly any left for manufacturing industries. We've divided those in process industries and the other heat and steam process of the industry. And I will come back to that. There's a little CO2 needed for those where CCS can't cover everything. But basically, the last emissions are reserved for the agricultural sector. But it's not only about figures, it's also about acceptance of technologies. 95% is, of course, more of all the technologies that you've already seen. More renewables, more electric vehicles, more efficiency, more renovation of buildings, all of that. And when you look at the heavy trucks, that was one of the issues we discussed, quite controversial, by the way. We went with current knowledge into electrification of a significant part of German autobahns, 4,000 and the 80% and 8,000 kilometers in this scenario. But that is just today's perspective of today's cost analysis. And we are quite aware that when it comes to heavy trucks, the race between the synfuels, biofuels, and the direct electrification is still open. So our policy recommendation is not to electrify German autobahns now, which is a huge investment, but to really invest in R&D, in bringing down the cost up to the mid-20s, and then with the lower cost, have a decision on an infrastructure rollout, whether it is on hydrogen, e-fuels, or on direct electrification, hopefully not only within Germany, but also together with neighbors, then it would make more sense. So, but that's the current technologies. Now the difficult ones. 3 examples why it is difficult. First of all, 95%, although we have all the research on CCU, will not be achievable from today's perspective without CCS, without significant amount of CCS when it comes to process industries. And I think we are all aware of the acceptance issues that CCS comes with. Second, we can electrify quite a lot, but there are limits to direct electrification, so we need some power-to-X technology. And even for our very electric scenarios, we would need in Germany 340 terawatt hours imports of renewable fuels, PTL, PTG, hydrogen, whatsoever. That means more or less the complete German electric generation fleet being rebuilt somewhere in Africa and Morocco only for the purpose to produce synfuels for Germany. That's the sheer size of this PTX production. And obviously that's nothing Germany can decide by its own. That's really an international challenge. We have to work together with those countries where we believe the conditions are better, more sun, more wind, hopefully both together, somewhere in the MENA region or other places, and we look another study with the World Energy Council now into that. What are the sites where this is useful? But this is, of course, a huge challenge we can't decide alone. And a third example, that is just to give you a flavor of, that's nothing abstract, that comes very close to individual households, individual voters. Even in farming, you would have to address and do something, whether it is to reduce the amount of cows by 1/3, or whether you would feed the cows with a methane pill that prohibits methane emissions of cows. That's already possible technically, but it shows, I think, and it's not allowed, I think, at the moment, it shows that you have to go very far and use really every technology you can make use of to get these very, very ambitious targets of 95% happen. And our conclusion in the end was 80% is something we could think of as an industry organization as a national target, even if Europe goes alone. But a 95% world, not only with the leakage and competitiveness issues, but also with the acceptance issues and the development of those technologies, is nothing we can achieve alone. That's something that needs a global effort. And that's the size of CCS in this abatement curve that goes up to 400 euro per ton of CO2 in the last columns, very right. Now let's come to the sector coupling, which is a huge issue in Germany in electricity sector. We talk a lot about sector coupling, and I'll show you how in these optimized scenarios that would look like. The yellow and orange colors are the new electricity demand of e-vehicles, heat pumps, district heating that comes in the electricity system. And in our optimized scenario, this additional demand will be more or less balanced out by efficiency gains in all the other uses of electricity. So at least in the reference path and the 80% path, this is more or less balanced. Only if you go with very ambitious targets, electricity demand would go very much up. Again, that's not the most likely one, but that would be the cost optimized world. On the supply side, very similar pictures for the first two. A lot of solar, a lot of wind, less coal in the 1930s or 40s. That's running out. Some sort of huge increase in gas capacity, almost tripling, that's the gray one, almost tripling the generation capacity of gas, and we have to find someone who wants to invest under the current circumstances in all these gas-fired power plants that will be used only for certain months of the year. So huge investment also in the current fleet. And with the 95%, then of course all those columns get a lot bigger. Jump over that. Electricity system cost, and we didn't look into distribution issues, just about this system cost will increase. The electricity system will get more expensive, but no explosion of the costs. You see, depending on the path you choose, there is a cost increase of say 20–30%, basically by the grid, which is probably the most dominant driver for cost increase. The imports of fossil energies will come down, and once you go into the very ambitious targets, power to X, that's the blue one here, will play a significant role, maybe even earlier, depending on the cost and the learning curves, the scaling of these technologies, which are quite unsure at the moment. Jump over that and go into the cost. That's the investment cost, and we looked into that for the agglomerated cost up to 2050. Roughly we say the difference between the reference path and the 80% is 1 trillion euro agglomerated, and even in the current policies of today, there's policy-induced cost of 530 billion euros. That's why we've put all those policy-induced costs together. More or less equally distributed, at least for the three sectors here. Industry sector is a little bit lower, also due to the use of biomass, and CCS, which is not that expensive, but of course that comes with the social acceptance issues, which have to be solved then. What is the net cost if you take the investment cost, you will have to subtract the imports of oil and gas, and obviously that depends very much on the oil prices that you assume. We've done some sensitivity analysis. With the very high oil prices, you come to quite low net costs of 500 billion. If you take low oil prices, that could be even 1 trillion euro of net cost for the economy. But the good news, at least for the 80% scenario, is in our modulations, economic modulations of multiplier effects and all that, 80% could be achieved in this optimized world under all the circumstances I've mentioned without harming the economy, with a neutral effect on the GDP growth. So 80% is a target we think is achievable, at least with what we've written down here in these optimized scenarios. 95%, on the contrary, is not only higher cost, but that comes with many, many challenges that we cannot really solve our own. And that's why that's probably more part of sort of upward scaling on the way, depending on what does the rest of the world policy-wise, depending on game changers that we've described, if technologies find an earlier breakthrough and all these things that you can't foresee for such a long period of 30 years. So policy recommendation in the end is have a monitoring process, look every 3 years on how does the world develop, is there an upward scale up of targets possible, but start with the 80%. Make sure that you really address and find a policy mix for each sector, as these sectors are very different. There's linear pathways for the building sector where with a certain amount of craftsmen you can renovate a certain amount of buildings and you have to start now. That's a robust policy recommendation. And there are other sectors where you can invest more in R&D to bring down cost earlier, transport sector with these very high costs, and then speed up the development. That would be sort of smarter way of going than just having all the sectors under the same umbrella of regulation. I'll leave it with that, maybe as an input, and I'm glad and happy for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Just one minute. Thanks a lot, Carsten. I think that is a really impressive study you've done, and I think for any organization that would have been like the achievement of all projects, and I think we can benefit a lot from it, also from other countries. And to me, it's also very encouraging conclusion. This with like existing technologies, reasonable assumptions will reach the -80% with at least close to zero net cost for society, if I got you right. When you present this to your member companies in the industrial association, or is this a picture that they share, or they accept these kind of conclusions, or what would be the discussions if we met some of your members?
Well, internally, of course, we had 1 year of long discussion on each of every technology, and everyone is fighting for his technology being bigger part of the cake and of the future of tomorrow. But in the end, we managed to really subscribe that as a consistent picture with all the branches from automotive to chemistry that are organized in our organization, with all the chances and challenges that are with it, and in the direction to the policymakers, the heading, mind the gap, the London subway heading, is really the key message. As we say, everything that goes beyond the 60%, 61%, needs additional policy push, whether it is on subsidies, whether it is on price incentives, whether it is some other sort of regulation. It will not happen for its own, as it doesn't make sense for the individual decision maker, investor. And that's why it's more a call for policymakers not to stick with the target discussion, but really go into the instruments. That's what we, I think, have to do.
Yeah. Great. I think that's another important insight that we brings with us, and we will get you back in the panel when we're winding up, and then you also will be able to some questions to all the panelists. Thank you. Yeah. So then, from Germany, going slightly westwards, United Kingdom, as I know, was the first country to introduce a carbon law, and the concepts of carbon budgets actually implemented within the core policy of government, the climate change committee to kind of guard the government or the policy. And I know that has inspired the Swedish parliament, the government, and many others also to follow in taking similar steps. And also on the international field, UK has shown true leadership in fighting climate change. So we are very keen now to hear from Professor John Lowhead. He's the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategies. I think industrial strategies sounds really great in this context. And department in a Swedish context would be ministerium, department, part of the UK government. And in this house, we should also mention that you are a fellow of the UK Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences. Welcome, please.
So under very strict instructions that I have exactly 18 minutes, and if I exceed that, I shall be interfered with by the technicians. Yes. So there we go. So let me see. Fine. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say that, as you've heard, the UK does have an approach. So I've called this presentation, There is a Plan. Whether the plan works is what we might go on to discuss. And very briefly, to set the scene, as we've just heard, within the UK we have a law called the Climate Change Act. And this requires the government to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This is not a target, it is a requirement. They have to meet it. The way that's done is through a series of carbon budgets, each of which lasts 5 years. And there is an independent committee on climate change which recommends what those targets should be. And this is the carbon budgets that have been agreed. When we say carbon, these are greenhouse gas emissions, but we use carbon as shorthand. 5-year periods, you'll see we've just finished the second 5-year period, which lasted till the end of last year. And then we've got budgets going out into the future. We have met the first 2 targets. We're on line to meet the 3rd and 4th budgets, but then it starts to get a little bit difficult. So if we actually look at what we need to address, the left-hand pie chart shows you the emissions by different sectors, and you'll see it covers all sectors of the economy. Business and industry is a quarter, transport is a quarter, power is almost the same size, and then we've got homes and natural resources. And on the right-hand side, you'll see for each of those sectors the actual reduction in emissions that have been achieved. So the policies so far have been fairly successful. And the other thing it's worth noting is over that period from 1990 on the left to 2015, the green lines show emissions. The one at the bottom is the UK. The one above that is the G7 group of nations. And then above is GDP. So this shows and illustrates that it is possible to grow GDP without allowing emissions to grow, while simultaneously reducing the scale of emissions. And that's a very important issue when it comes to dialogue with the political community, because ultimately they're interested in GDP. They'd like emissions to go down, but if emissions don't go down and GDP grows up, that's a slightly disappointing result, but acceptable. GDP going down and emissions going down is unacceptable. So, when we look out at the future to our 5th carbon budget, to 2032, we have exactly what Carsten's talk about. What's the pathway? What are we going to do? So we take this from a slightly different viewpoint, which is we are talking about a target which is 15 years in the future, with an ultimate target that is more than 30 years in the future. we accept that we do not know what the technological options will be in front of us in that timescale. And therefore, when we look at future pathways, we test uncertainties in the technologies that we might be able to get. So when we develop our strategies, we will set the strategy based on what we believe is likely to be a probable pathway, but we accept that as we move forward through time, we will change direction because of our inability to be able to see what the future will hold. Now, in order to look at what that future might be, we use a modelling system called UK Times. This is based upon the modelling system originally developed by the International Energy Agency. It is used quite widely. UK Times, however, is nothing more than a big Excel spreadsheet. And the critical thing is to do with what data do you put in UK Times, because in order to run it, you've got to make assumptions about the future development of costs, the future capability of technology, the future evolution in population, in inflation, in fuel prices, and all kinds of things. So essentially, you can get out of this whatever answer you want. It all depends on what data you put in. And I don't say that to trivialize this, but to explain that we are dealing here with inherent high levels of uncertainty. And if we don't accept that we cannot state a pathway to the future, then we will pick something that we cannot deliver. So the elements of the models are debated at great length, and then we do a series of runs. Typically, we do thousands of different runs to create scenarios, and out of those thousands of results, we try to pick what looks like the least cost routes and the routes that will satisfy multiple goals. And that is fed in to the development of the policies that underpin our intent on how we will meet our climate goals. Now, the latest approach to this was published just about 6 or 7 months ago, which was the UK's industrial strategy. And the industrial strategy laid down what the current UK government was going to do in terms of policy steps to try to ensure that the GDP carried on going up, but hopefully at a faster rate. And it contained 4 big areas of development, one of which was clean growth. I'll say what the other ones are later. But the purpose of this was to predicate, to make the assumption that there would be a global shift to clean growth, that non-clean growth would become politically and socially unacceptable, and that therefore the key would be to find the best ways of delivering that. And as part of what the government in the UK was going to do was to say, well, key to this will be, first of all, innovation. So the government will have to introduce significant additional support to innovation. And I'll come on to what that is in a moment. And the second was, how do we provide the framework, the legal framework, the financial framework, and the regulatory framework that would actually enable the markets for the outputs of those new innovations and new approaches to come successfully and grow into the markets. And then how would we use the overall industrial strategy activity to meet the clean growth strategy? So, as part of that, there is a clean growth strategy. UK Times we've spoken about, and that looked at different routes towards doing it. Now, Carsten produced some very, very impressive analyses, which I respect and admire, and some of those are buried in what I'm going to show you here. But I've tried to extract out the main messages that came out of that. And that was that we had 3 broad strategic directions that we could go in. The first was to move towards progressive electrification of the UK's economy. And that would then be the main source of energy for heating, for industry, for transport, and for most other things. The second possible route was that we moved down a route of using hydrogen as the main thermal energy vector, and that we would use that for clean fuel for homes, for buildings, for industry. And then the third element was that we would go predominantly to capture emissions by continuing to use our existing fuel sources. And what that showed was that we could meet the targets, exactly as Kirsten said earlier, by any of these mechanisms. We could get to the same results, but by very different means. So the question then is, how do we try to set targets that will enable some of these to come through? So what the Clean Growth Strategy does is set various targets. And I'm not going to go into these detail, but for transport, we're about to publish our strategy in the UK for how we're going to go down to zero emissions on transport on a timescale of 2050. We've got targets for improving business efficiency, on homes, which is the second down on the left there. The Prime Minister in the UK announced just 2 weeks ago that the aim was to ensure that the emissions characteristics of homes, the carbon footprint, was halved by 2035 by a series of specific interventions in designs, regulations and standards. We're pursuing carbon capture and storage as well as renewables. There's work on natural resources, and there's a big role for the public sector in all of this. Now, all of these things emerge in terms of specific targets, and some of these then come down into greater elements. These just show some of them for 3 of the areas, which is business, homes and transport. And you'll see, for instance, at the bottom there on transport, there is a stated intention that all conventional petrol and diesel cars will no longer be allowed to be sold after 2040. There's money on development of technologies, there's strategies on buses, and there's also encouragement for cycling and walking. And the other thing that I'd like to pull out in the second group here, at the top for electricity, there's also a declared intent that coal-fired electricity generation will no longer be permitted after 2025. That is unabated coal-fired. If you've got carbon capture and storage, you can use it. The position on carbon capture and storage in the UK is different to in other parts of Europe in that there is no significant public opposition to the concept of carbon sequestration geologically. And therefore, with a large fleet of currently disused wells in the North Sea, there are quite a number of areas to take it. Then going down, there's work on agriculture, on waste and resources, which is going off, and then specific public sector targets. I mentioned earlier innovation. So the other thing that the current government has done is it has introduced an increase of 40% in the public sector support for research, development and innovation in low carbon areas. This just relates to low carbon. So the amount allocated to that is £2.5 billion, and the allocation of where that will be spent is shown on the right-hand side. And you'll see that transport and power take up an enormous amount of that because those are seen as the biggest areas that require support. So that's broadly the approach that's being taken. You might say there is a little lack of detail on specifics and numbers in there. They do exist, but I didn't think you'd remember them if I tried to put them all in now. So I'd now like to just shift a little bit and talk about what our National Academy of Engineering has done in the context of this. And what it has done is, rather than the detailed studies, has undertaken a series of policy studies over the last 7 or 8 years, which have been done to look at what the main technological direction should be that influence government policy. And one of the first ones was a report that was published in 2010, before many of the government policies had been settled, which actually talked about what do we need to do if we are going to have clean electrical power generation to start with. And the first element of that was to say, under a number of scenarios, it doesn't matter what those scenarios are, but we find that we first of all cannot predict exactly what system we're going to do, so there's no silver bullet as it describes, that we need demand reduction as a key part of that, that we're going to need to deploy all of the available low-carbon technologies that we can currently identify. And then the final points that we have sort of heard elsewhere is that the scale of the engineering challenge in achieving this is enormous. And there was a phrase in the report that said this will require the biggest peacetime transformation of the economy that this country has ever seen if you're going to achieve those targets. Now, that report was quite helpful in that those high-level messages were landed and can actually be seen now as reflected in many of the government policies. And I think this was an illustration of where national academies play an important role, not to define the policy, but to say what the constraints are that you will have to handle in the policy. That was followed by a number of reports that were done in a similar way on different elements of the energy system. So it looked at heat, electric vehicles, the implication of large-scale activities. And what came out of that was a consistent message saying you cannot look at any of these in isolation. You've got to think of the complete energy system. This is exactly consistent with the message we heard from Germany in looking at how these things interact and what the interdependencies will be. And then they were accompanied by a series of reports. When I say reports, these are typically about 30 to 50 pages long. And these were to the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. And it looked at issues like the diminishing electrical generation capacity on the UK system and why some of the moves towards low carbon and some of the moves towards competitive markets were actually driving down to what was a technically undesirable circumstance and what might be done to count for that. And then the other thing was to look at what the economic cost of some of those risks and narrowing margins were, and therefore the case for how those might be countered. And then subsequently, as time went on and policies were coming out, there was another report that says you're not going fast enough. If we actually look at what is required to deliver these targets, there are still risks to the pathways that you're developing. And some of the things that came off there were to say you've got to have a much greater level of effort in carbon capture and storage, in nuclear technologies and in offshore wind, which are all parts of the UK's strategy, because you're not going fast enough. And more importantly, just on the third bullet point there, you've got to work harder on reducing energy demand. And this has now been mirrored in some of the policies that I described earlier about very aggressive targets on housing energy demand into the future. So, as part of some of the activities that are underway, there has been work I mentioned very briefly on hydrogen pathways. So I just want to say one or two things that are coming out of the system here. A couple of years ago, under support from our energy regulator, there was a very substantive study done looking at the feasibility of converting the existing gas distribution network in one of our cities in the north of England, Leeds, to work on 100% hydrogen. And the reason for that was that the gas networks and the industry were concerned that as we got further down the energy chain, there would be a difficulty for them to continue to trade in their business, and that they could be left with a major stranded asset in the very expensive gas network. So they looked at decarbonising. Can we use it for 100% hydrogen? And this was quite a detailed study. You can find it online. But the answer broadly was yes. And there was something that said, and this is if you did it, what the carbon savings would be. The importance of this study was that it changed the debate about hydrogen in the UK, because before it had been seen as something that was of academic interest but impossibly expensive to deploy. What this study said was, from the view of an operator, from an engineering standpoint, if you want, we can do this, and we can do it progressively, so there's quite a long way to go. How am I doing on time, Ulla? I'm about to sum up. Okay. So there's work also going on with other countries. So with Canada, we were doing work on smart grids. We're doing the same thing with South Korea. There on the right is a picture of me last week opening a demonstration plant of 5 megawatts liquid air energy storage system, which is being used as a demonstrator to look at the feasibility of putting in place sort of very long-term storage of energy for going on. Okay, so there we are. We've got, that's a very quick run over the area, but the next steps, how is this going to take forward? 3 things. First of all, there is an interministerial group, as we call it, that is ministers from different departments in the UK are in a group who are charged with devising the implementation of the actions to meet the strategic goals. The second thing is that clean growth is now one of the key elements of the UK's industrial strategy, and there is a specific requirement on finding ways in which that can be used to drive industrial and economic growth. So not something you've got to do while you're living life as normal, but actually, how does this get embedded? And then the third element is the recognition that the biggest challenge is the fact that many of us are very interested in this. The majority of the population in this industry are not. It's something that really they'd rather didn't happen. So what we've got to do is find ways of delegating down and engaging with the wider community. And with that, I shall stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that 8-minute presentation of excellent 18 minutes presentation of the greatest peacetime transformation of the UK economy ever. That's an achievement as such. And a lot of interesting points to follow up on, and I think about as many figures that we can handle. But I think I have a specific question, because I'm curious, which is not exactly the core of the things you presented, but if now this Brexit idea is followed through, and the European emission trading system is an important part of your policy, as it is for Sweden and Germany, is there a clear idea on Britain will still be in the carbon trading system, or that is still on the table? Or?
Well, that's still one of the things that's part of the negotiation. I think fairly clearly there's been a statement that the UK would like, after it's left the EU, to continue to participate in a number of activities where it is felt that there is mutual benefit to do. The ETS is potentially one of those, and so an offer has been on the table. At the moment, the European Commission are showing limited enthusiasm for some of the proposals, but no doubt we will see how that goes as we move forward.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joe. We will come back to a lot of other interesting points
Thank you,
later. Thanks a lot. So then let's turn east, all the way to China, a country where everything counts in billions, I think. Not only the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on Earth, or the largest user of coal, but also the #1 producer of clean energy technologies, the #1 investment market for new renewable electricity production, and all sorts of. Also, I think, if I got the numbers right, the #1 in per capita use of electric vehicles in the world, which is something when you then once again multiply it with 1 billion. And we have now the privilege to have Dr. Han Gui here. He has, it's not really true that you traveled this morning all the way from Beijing. He's actually, since 15 years, I think, a research fellow of the Stockholm Environment Institute. And I think the focus of your research has actually been maybe in the wider consequences, social and environmental consequences of the Chinese transformation, both in China and the meaning for the rest of the world. So I think that is a very good kind of coming perspective into this discussion. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ola. And it's truly an honor and humbled to be asked to share some, well, supposedly insights on climate mitigation strategies in China. I don't know whether I have any insights as such, but also compared to our previous speakers, you're not looking at a real expert in this field. but rather we would like to call ourselves the China watcher. We watch more or less the big pictures. So what I can do is try to tell you a story, paint a story about this journey that combining China's modernization at the same time combating the climate change challenges, what China has been doing, where China is at the moment, according to what, the watching result by us. So it will be just very plain paint and examples of what I see as, again, what China has been committed, what China has been doing, and use two examples to illustrate what I think is at the moment in terms of international collaboration with China, and the sense that China desperately need to get a better sense of where we're going. That is the coal, and also this issue of waste of renewable energies. So that's basically what I try to do. And just before I start, is again, as the China watcher, and every time I tell a China story, it's always good to remind everybody this is the scale and the speed of the story. Because it's every number that divided, as Ola said, by the 1.4 billion is a small one. But the other side is a humongous one. And even a small percentage every year, now China can change it instantly and makes the whole lot of a global budget issue that difference. So in addition to, like our colleagues in Germany, UK, maybe here in Sweden, we do need those really cutting edge showcases and on how this is done. But in China, I think it's that effort solving the immediate challenges and making that little percentage of difference every year that will make the whole global situation all much better. Yes. Maybe it's this one?
Okay. No. This big one.
Ah, the big one. Sorry. So this is I was prepared this and on my computer still have those files and on the September 6th, if you remember, that's the G20 in Hangzhou in 2016, the great moment that Obama and Xi shook hands with Ban Ki-moon and rectified the Paris Agreement. So under that, what China has really have promised is those 2020 goals is already more or less China has committed even before the Copenhagen COP. That is to have, again, this is intensity targets. It's important to remember that. It's 40 to 45 up on the level of 2005. And then we have the share of primary energy consumption of the non-fossil. This is also include nuclear, reach 15% by 2020. Then we have some forest goals. And then this is more clearly written into the NDC as the commitment China made under the Paris Agreement. And with this, and we had one, and this everybody knows now, is the peaking around the 2020. It is an indication of the absolute target, but the rest is still the intensity target. Is 60 to 65 below 60 reduction to the level of 2005. And by, again, the non-fossil fuel share of the primary energy consumption reach 20%. And then again, we have the forest. So those are, there's a few other which I omitted. For example, there's mention of the HFCs and all that, but it's basically other non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases are explicitly mentioned in the commitment. So when I listed those climate goals, and I thought it's important in China now, is also just to flesh some out those, what do we call, the development of societal goals. Because those are the things is still vitally important for China. And it's the balance of those where lies the challenge. You see, those things also shows the complexities of those terms, and for people outside China to have a grasp of those things. For example, immediately coming up, and which we're confident that China is achieving, is something we call the Xiaokang society. That's the translation is this all-round well-off society. Some say it's moderately prosperous society goal. And for this, one of those indicators, you will, is to double the per capita income based on the 2010 level. You see, it's those kind of things that still has very central, and raising up the living standard is central. And then since the 19th Party Conference, Congress, we added another goal, is the 2035. China will again become this basic modern economy with ecological civilization. And then by 2050, and China is aimed to become one of the rich countries. So I will not go into any one of them in terms of what are the major mitigation strategies in China. But one of those is more directly centered with the intensity targets of including the international commitment, is China still does this so-called 5-year plans. And I'm sure many of you in the audience are quite China expert yourself. The 5-year plans, the social economic development plans. So since 2005, China has started to include compulsive energy conservation, namely energy intensity targets, and since 2011, and also adding the carbon intensity targets. So those are compulsory. We can talk long about how those goals are set and how those are disaggregated, negotiated between the central and the provinces. And many of you have heard, and China also launched a national emission trading system by the end of last year. It's only in the very beginning of this national system, and how effective this will be is remain to be seen. And of course, the major thing is the economic restructuring at the moment. China has landed with a humongous overcapacity issue in many sectors. Those sectors happen to be also the high energy efficiency, high polluting. So that restructuring is very much in the process, and as a strategy. And in another list, it's all about the energy system and how China is. And I will not touch on this, just again show you a flavor for when we talk about strategies and what China is doing. And those things now, and in the political scene, all are very important things to look into as we understand what is driving and guiding whatever China is doing. So I'll quickly say at this juncture how China is doing. China is doing in the sense of fulfilling the global climate agreement, the NDCs under the Paris Agreement. I think many, it's not just us, many analysts that agree, and we're China is at the moment very comfortable achieving those goals. In fact, the 2020 targets is more or less all has been achieved. But the question is, how much more? How much more that China can speed up, and how much more that the room of speeding up will be included in the upcoming 2020 reporting and the 2025 renewal of the NDC. So that's many are discussing outside China and also inside of China. This actually just last week, one of the State Council, Development Research Council, has released a report, again, hinging on that, say, start to pass on some recommendations to the government as say, how should handle this NDC, upcoming NDC renewal is something keen for us to watch. And this is basically say that, so I think I'm quickly looking at the time that I'm running out. Coal is absolutely essential, not for China and globally in terms of our battle with the climate change mitigation. And there's a good news since 2013. And again, among the China experts in the audience, you probably know this. 2013 was a quite shock to many of us. China actually peaked their coal use. Until that time, many was anticipated, 2030 will be early, but 2013 and then 14, 15, 16 continues to drop. But last year, it's actually rebounded. And the rebounded, although it's very still lower than the 2013 level, but analysis just came out early this spring by colleagues in the Berkeley Lawrence Lab. And it has showed a quite alarming scenario. What they believe from their latest analysis is that China's coal not peaked. And in fact, if you see the last bar there is even a scenario that it could have another surprise. But this is just 2-3 years. So for us, as again the China watchers, that's the key we're watching, is where this is going. Of course, there's all kinds of pathway studies from different organizations looking into all the details, and equally split, I would say at the moment, is many think it could be stagnant, which is already alarming, and others say, and it could reduce. And to us, whether this will reduce or not has a lot to do with this challenge, which this is China's renewable investment, and it's all led to this literally explosive growth of the renewable and the wind and the solar installation. But, and since 2010 particularly, you can see the divergence between those power, the renewable powers being installed and those being used. So the gaps that the window, in other words, we're wasting more and more of the installed capacities. And this is compiled, we just compiled this in terms of wind itself, and how much has been wasting. And for many of you, I think it's, 5 is considered high, 5%, and 1 or 2% probably is acceptable. And China, and 2017 is slightly better, and 2016 reached 17% of the wind. This is the wind alone. And it's not just wind. If you look at this part, and that is waste of wind, waste of solar, and waste of hydro. And adding together, again, remember I said in earlier, think the scale in China. And those are humongous numbers. For example, the wind curtailment or the waste alone in 2017 is equivalent to the entire electricity use of Bangladesh. So it's that kind of thing. If you add all this, and you convert that to what that means for the emission, the number is just humongous. I think, do I still, 2 minutes, okay. So instead of, talk about in general China's international cooperation, of course, everybody now, China is cooperating with everybody, and everybody, especially on the climate-related issues, is cooperating with China. But for us at SEI at the moment, what we are promoting everybody is to collaborate on China, advise China, or share the useful experiences in China on the power market redesign. I think in that area, Europe is truly leading, tackling this complexity of the power market redesign. Much of that experience is desperately and urgently needed. And that includes on the whole aspects of the power system, the sources, the network, the grid, the demand, and of course the key words has the flexibility of the system. The clean energy transition is no longer the story about cost. It's really about the flexibility in the new energy system. And China is right at the moment tackling that challenge. And to us, unless that has quickly resolved, and there's a whole momentum of renewable development in China, and the curtailment challenge would not get fundamentally improved. So I will not go into this. This is to say the red numbers are the real numbers for 2017. And we also have various pathways, like the earlier UK or Germany did firmware. This is one of those pathway studies. It's called Reinventing Fire China. It's between the Energy Research Institute of the NDRC and the Mountain Institute in the US. They did the 2050 roadmap or the pathways. According to them, what I use to this is just to show the challenge there is still huge. And this all hinge on, this is at the moment, just throwing some quick numbers here. I don't know for the our UK, the EU countries, whether those numbers are still up to date. But still, the point of that is, as Europe already, with our current situation, regulation, technologies, has reached this, and China is still at a fraction. So if we, through collaboration, that can even be increased, again, the scale of China, 1%, will be a much different situation.
Thanks a lot, Han. Once again, things can look very familiar, like the challenge or the flexibility of the electricity system, but just that it gets, the dimensions are different in the Chinese context. One question, where you started, since these societal goals and social and economic goals is so much still centerpiece for the Chinese government. For a long time, China in the global discussions simply refused to discuss anything like than the intensity goals or carbon intensity or energy intensity for understandable reasons. But now, I mean, there is talking about the peaking of the absolute numbers of emissions. which was an important thing that when it happened. And what made that change, you think, the underlying reasoning in the government?
I guess one thing is the speed of development in China has, in a way, over the past 40 years, it's not surprised many international people, also surprised us Chinese itself.
Yeah.
We never thought that we could, and things happen this fast. Back to 2005, when we were commissioned by the Swedish Prime Minister's office to have a little book on interpreting China's climate challenge in that context, we look into you see the narrative of that time in China is still about rights for development and how that. But in the past decades, as earlier Professor John said, China also quickly switched that. There is a growth story, the clean growth story in this. So you quickly see the convergence of, on one side, the convergence of the grand development goals and the climate. That's one side. The other side perhaps contribute to this shift is again China's fundamental change, or well, not fundamental, at least a notable change of international relation policies. And there's a time that we, excuse my language, we have a policy that we try to lie low. We're not showing big, but increasingly today, China is coming out to taking, willing, at least willing, to take some of the leadership roles, and including the climate area in the past 2-3 years. So all those things perhaps has contributed.
Yeah, I guess. Well, it's an exciting change, as you point out.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, thank you, Han. Yeah. Now the organizers have had the courage to put in a short break, so you can have a chance to stretch your legs and talk to your neighbors. But we'll still try to start up again on 10:45. So this will be a short break.
Hallå allihopa, kom och sätt er. Stefan.
Am I on this? Yeah, great. Okay, we'll continue our global journey from China further east, crossing then the Pacific Ocean, arriving at the Canadian coast, west coast. And that is then also the District of British Columbia. And apart from Canada being the kind of second largest country in the world, area based, and free of even 4 times the Swedish population, except for that, we tend to think that we have some similarities in low density of population, large resources, both in biomass and hydropower, a lot of primary industry, and also I think partly in some kind of the political culture maybe. So we expect there would be a lot of interesting connections to policies of Canada and British Columbia. And then we are really curious to listen to Dr. Amy Sopinka, Director in the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources at British Columbia. And yeah, she will speak both, I think, on the national, federal, Canadian level, and also connect somewhat to the British Columbia situation. Welcome,
Thank
please.
you.
Floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a delight to be in Stockholm for my very first time and see the beautiful city that you live in. As Ulla commented, I'm from British Columbia. I live on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island. Today, my presentation, although I will touch on some of the provincial responsibilities of climate change, I'll be looking at a new pan-Canadian framework for climate change and clean growth that Canada has presented. And then I will touch on, as part of the challenges, provincial responsibilities. So I think it's been told before, said before, but I am not here representing the government of Canada or the government of British Columbia, although I may comment on some of the policies that are in place, but I do not speak for officially for either of those organizations, nor for any of the provinces that I will talk about. I have a fairly good knowledge of the provinces and the activities that are going on in between them, but not a fulsome expertise on the other provinces, especially as we get further to the east. So I may just touch on those. Definitely don't speak for those people. So as part of my presentation, I wanted to give you some context for Canada and the Canadian issue of climate change. We have a population of about 36 million, 35.2 million people, about 10% of the size of our neighbors to the south, the United States of America. You may have heard of them and their climate change policies. So we are 10% of the population, but we are the second largest country in the world, second only to Russia, with just nearly 10 million square kilometers in land size. Canada has the longest coastline in the world, going across 3 different oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. We have our country made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. And this is grade 7 geography for me, but if you want, I will talk about some of the provinces in Canada. And it turns out that this provincial territorial relationship is very key to Canada meeting Canada's climate change goals. The other pieces there are some economic pieces. Our growth rate is about 1.2%, although we are in a bit of a growth period right now. Our unemployment rate is 6.9%. We have a fairly large national debt, and our current interest rate is 0.5%, and it has been there for a little while. Our total emissions for Canada are 704 megatons, and that's the number that we are going to be trying to move from as part of the climate plan. So this graph here shows you where those 704 megatons come from. Approximately 25% of them, or a quarter of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, are a result of oil and gas extraction and processing. You may have heard of our oil sands. And then we have a large natural gas sector as well. And then offshore oil in Newfoundland and off the coast of Newfoundland on the east side of Canada. Another 25% of our emissions come from the transportation sector. And that's a common theme I've been hearing around the different presentations, is that transportation is one of those areas in which countries are really going to try to drive down their emissions from. And it seems that it's maybe one of those doable action items that we could do. And then the remaining 50% come from agriculture, our built environment. So Canada, you may have heard, is quite cold. It can be cold, not on the west coast, which is why I live there. But in general, lots of the country experiences very cold weather in the winter, and so we have a big heating need. So I think there was the record cold temperature in Canada was reached in the Yukon, and it was minus 63 degrees Celsius. So we get quite cold. Anecdotally, I lived in Alberta and Ontario and Quebec in my life. Part of the reason that drove me west to the warmer temperatures, but it regularly gets to minus 40 degrees Celsius in the winter in at least Alberta. And so we have this strong heating need, and that's maybe where you're seeing the emissions from the built environment coming from. So we have 704 megatons of equivalent CO2 emissions in Canada. This was in 2016. This is where we fit in the global context. So in terms of Canada's total emissions, we're about 1.6% of global GHG emissions. And you can see where the rest of them fit, the rest of the countries fit. And this is a bit important in terms of understanding what we're aiming for. We hear a lot about different aspects of Canada's Canada's energy system, and we see that, you know, although the oil sands makes up 9.3% of emissions, in total Canada only has 1.6% of global emissions. That's not to say that there isn't actions that we can take to reduce those even further, and that's where Canada's Paris Accord commitments came in. So you need to make a distinction here. Canada was the one that was signed. Canada, the country of Canada, the government of Canada, was the signatory to the COP21 Paris Accord. And Canada agreed to making a commitment to reduce GHG levels to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Our parliament ratified that agreement on October 5th in order to make that a reality. So our federal government signed the Paris Accord. So that's important to know. Now, as a result of that Paris Accord commitment, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change was adopted. Now, why am I going on a little bit about this? Well, first of all, you may know we have a fairly new government. Our Right Honourable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, and along with his new government came a new invigorated climate change action plan. Now, the action, though, needs to be both at the federal and the provincial level, because of the way that, and I'll talk about this when I talked about challenges, but there are specific responsibilities that lie between the federal government and the provincial government. So in order to make a federal goal of the 30% reduction, there had to be a consensus by the provinces, and that's where the Pan-Canadian Framework comes in. It was a collaboration by most, but not all, of the provinces in Canada to look at ways that the federal government could incent reductions in climate change. So the goal is to accelerate clean economic growth, reduce emissions, and build resilience. So one of the key aspects or the biggest aspect of the federal government's plan is to implement a carbon price. So the government of Canada has set a benchmark price for carbon of $10 per ton, rising to $50 per ton by 2022. Okay. Now, 4 provinces in Canada already have a carbon pricing mechanism in place. British Columbia was the first jurisdiction to implement a revenue-neutral carbon tax, in 2008. Alberta has a carbon levy, and Ontario and Quebec are both involved in a cap and trade organization with the state of California. Okay. The remaining 6 provinces need to have a carbon tax in place by 2019, or the federal government will institute what they call a carbon pricing backstop. That is, they will impose a carbon price on those jurisdictions that haven't chosen to do so. Even with the federal government's imposition of the carbon tax or this carbon backstop, the revenues that result from that will flow back to the individual provinces. So if you generated the tax within your province, you will receive the revenue from that tax within your province. Which is all fantastic, which is great. So I was just sorry. The issue is that not all the provinces agree with it, and one province in particular is very much against putting a carbon tax, feeling that they have done other policies, invested in clean technology and other things, and they do not want to implement a carbon tax, and that's really going to go. I think it might be going for a lawsuit up to the Supreme Court, although I haven't done enough research to find out where that is. But Saskatchewan will not implement a carbon tax and did not sign on as part of the Pan-Canadian framework. So the mitigation, so the big piece of the Pan-Canadian framework was the imposition of a carbon price. Now, the government also proposed some mitigation measures. So one of the things is, one of the things is the expanding the use of clean electricity and low carbon fuels. So one thing that the government is doing is looking at how to implement a Canada-wide low carbon fuel standard that would be used in order to displace fossil fuels or higher emitting fossil fuels in both transportations, buildings, and industries. And then in terms of the electricity system, Canada has a fairly clean electricity system overall. We have about 80% of electricity in Canada comes from carbon-free sources, about 65% from renewable resources. And so part of the federal government's plan is to make the grid cleaner by regulations that would accelerate the phase out of coal technologies, in areas that still use them, in provinces that still use them, and adding performance standards for natural gas generation. So a benchmark for the best in class natural gas generation. And then also using and enhancing transmission systems between the provinces. Not all, as you can expect in a country that's the size of Canada, we have very different electricity systems in the different grids. So British Columbia, for example, is 96% clean. We have a lot of large hydroelectricity resources. Our neighbors right to the east of us, Alberta, is heavily fossil fuel. They've had a lot of carbon and coal through coal and natural gas generation. And so if you can interconnect those grids, you can actually transmit electricity from British Columbia to Alberta and displace some fossil fuels. So there's 2 pieces to cleaning up the grid, really getting rid of high emitting GHG generation sources and then replacing them with renewable energy resources or transmitting cleaner energy resources from other provinces. Then Canada is also going to be addressing, and this has got a lot of words on it, and I'll just highlight a few of these things. These are the mitigation measures that were proposed in the Pan-Canadian framework. In the built environment, one is developing a net zero energy ready housing strategy for new houses by 2030. And then retrofitting existing buildings. In the transportation sector, the big item there is creating a ZEV strategy, a zero emissions vehicle strategy. And and then the infrastructure to support that. So you can imagine we've got a big country that's a lot of roads, and there's, you know, we have to have the infrastructure around in order to support those ZEVs. And then also investing in transportation, the clean transportation, so hydrogen buses, electric buses, and other things. In the industrial sector, one of the big items for reducing GHG emissions is going to be a regulation that will decrease the amount of methane emissions from the natural gas and oil sector by 40 to 45% by 2025. And then also some work on the Montreal Protocol in terms of hydrofluorocarbons. So in order to support this, the federal government had announced measures in their budget 2017 of an investment of 21.9 billion Canadian dollars over 11 years to support all of these activities. So there'll be $17 billion in infrastructure investments, of which $9.2 billion is allocated to each of the provinces. So each province gets an allocation of that, except for Saskatchewan, because they did not sign into the Pan-Canadian framework. The other interesting piece, and I'm really interested to hear from the bank, is that Canada is setting up a Canadian infrastructure bank, and it's going to seed $5 billion for each of 3 years in order to attract private dollars for investment in infrastructure that will support energy emissions reductions in the energy sector. And then another $2.8 billion for a series of national programs. And they include, in Canada, we have a number of remote communities, especially remote communities with Indigenous people in them who are dependent on diesel fuel. So there are some funds to reduce the reliance on diesel fuel while improving grid reliability, for example. That's one of the examples of the national programs that are in place. And then another $2 billion through a low carbon economy fund that is specifically aimed at reducing gas emissions and the transition to a low carbon economy. And so that was allocated, I believe, by province, and then a certain amount to each province based on, I think, population. So this is Canada's path to achieving its carbon emissions, although you'll see that this is not quite right. This was projected emissions in December 2016, and it turns out that our emissions in 2016 were actually 704 megatons, so it's slightly lower than where government expected it to be. The blue line here represents all of where emissions will be under the Pan-Canadian framework. So as a result of the methane emissions, as a result of the federal carbon price, and as a result of all of the activities that were set out in the Pan-Canadian framework, there's an expectation that the emissions will be here at 567 megatons. And then the gap to get to the Canadian target of 523 megatons is going to be, hopefully, is expected to come from additional investments by the provinces, including additional green infrastructure, clean technology. Innovation is a big part of Canada's plan, which I haven't really talked about. There's a lot of focus on research and development, RD&D, and clean tech in order to improve technology and help support both the federal and the provincial goals. So that's the federal picture. That's Canada's climate change strategy, is basically predicated on the Pan-Canadian framework and the carbon pricing that the federal government is expecting to occur. The challenges. So under the Canada's Constitution Act, both exploring non-renewable resources, developing, conserving, and managing non-renewable resources is an exclusive purview of the province. So each province has ultimate control about how they develop their resources, and the federal government isn't able to do anything that would be counter to that. The only exception is for projects that or for energy that goes across borders, provincial borders, or internationally. So for us into the United States, or for us into the United States. So this is why at the beginning I made that big distinction about the federal government and its climate change goals, and then what the provinces are going to do. Because it turns out that this Constitution Act means there's very little room for the federal government to do to enforce or require any changes on behalf of things like the oil sands. That's exclusively an Alberta purview. Okay. And so, you know, my third and fourth point here is Canada is the third largest crude oil exporter, and 97% of Canada's oil reserves are in the oil sands, which is exclusively under Alberta control. In addition, Canada is the fourth largest producer and exporter of natural gas, and we have resources of natural gas that could sustain the current production for 300 years. So we've got a lot. We're sitting on a lot of gas. And of course, the shale revolution and hydraulic fracking and directional drilling has really both made gas more prevalent and really has reduced the cost of it. I think... yeah, the cost of gas is remarkably low in Canada right now. I don't know what it is in Europe, but it's in the $1 per GJ range. Gigajoule. Oh, sorry. Okay, so quickly, Canada's emissions by provinces. So this is again why this provincial issue is important. You can see that the biggest producers of emissions in Canada are Alberta. We've got all that oil sands and oil and gas development there. In Ontario, big manufacturing, and Quebec, a lot of mining and manufacturing as well. Just so that you don't think Canada isn't, or the rest of the province aren't doing anything, many of the provinces have their own climate goals. Okay. And they will be, and these goals are embedded in Canada's ability to meet its Paris Accord agreements. And I'd be happy to talk to any of you about the goals here that we have. So you'll see, just the one that I do want to point out is Alberta doesn't have one, but it has capped emissions from the oil sands at 100 megatons. So it will not allow or permit any projects that would exceed that cap. And then British Columbia, the province that I'm from, we have just created new goals for our emissions of 40% by reduction below 2007 levels by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 80% by 2050. In terms of international cooperation, so Canada has pledged $2.6 billion to help developing countries. And most recently, Canada has signed a partnership agreement with France to help other countries to implement carbon pricing systems and improve energy efficiency and cut emissions from transportation. That's probably all I need to go since I'm running out of time. I will go back. I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for giving us a very clear and interesting presentations on maybe aspects that we not reflect on every day in Sweden, like your constitutional.
Yeah, sorry, but it's important to understand why we don't just do one thing.
Yeah, and I mean, within the European Union, we can that kind of challenges are familiar as well in a way.
Excellent.
I had one thought. It's really interesting to have within the same country or within this federal level, both provinces opting for a carbon tax and then cap and trade system, and even doing that together with California outside the country. But as I got it, now the remaining 6 or 5 provinces, they tend to go for a tax or a levy rather than, or is that a discussion of pros and cons? Because you have learned now from both kind of systems.
Yeah, so I think the decision on what kind of carbon price that the province will put in is up to them, and that's an internal discussion I think that they would have at the provincial level. It doesn't matter as long as the effective price equals the minimum benchmark that the federal government has set. That said, I don't,
is there a trend towards either, or?
I think that. No, not really. I think that it's really people are in industry in particular is looking for certainty. So the carbon tax is nice for that because they know for certain and can build it into their business model, where carbon cap and trade provides more flexibility. So I think it depends. We won't know until, I guess, by the end of this year when people have declared what they're going to do.
Okay, we'll follow that closely.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll see you later again. An applause even for Amy. Okay. Sometimes when we do not like to feel this small in Sweden compared to these G7 countries present, or 6+1 or whatever nowadays, present in this room today, we tend to say that we're part of a broader Nordic economy, a market, which then I think if we add up, it could come close to Canada or among the top 10 or dozen global economies, I think. And to some extent that's true. I think many the larger companies in this region consider the Nordic market as their home market. And we do, for example, have an electricity market, cross-boundary electricity market, which I think is the best functioning cross-border electricity market that we have seen so far in the world. But this cooperation is largely without any overstated or much of common institutions, but there are a few, and among them the Nordic Investment Bank, nowadays also co-owned by the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the other side of the Baltic Sea. And the next presentation will be from NIB, the Nordic Investment Bank, being then active in investing in this transition that we have talked about already, and on a more of an aggregated policy level. So now we will hear from that investment perspective, colleagues of Thomas, and that will be Lena Korkeaau, Senior Environmental Analyst and Sustainability and Mandate Unit at NIB, and her colleague Patrick maybe, Market, Senior Manager Lending Department, Energy and Environment. Please. I will see how you arrange your presentation, but it will be kind of a joint one. Yeah. So it
will be cooperation.
Yes. Great.
Well done. Yes.
Okay. Dear ladies and gentlemen, organizers and guests, thank you for being here and listening to the Nordic Investment Bank. Some of you might ask what is a bank doing here at the Climate Change Seminar, and hopefully this presentation will provide an answer to that. My name is Patrick Market, and I work with origination in our Energy and Environment group, and together with me today I have Lena Korkeaau.
So as the serious bankers we are, of course we have to start by looking at investment needs connected to climate targets. We have the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to take us to a target below 2 degrees in global warming. But we all know that currently it doesn't look so good in achieving that target. Estimates by the UN Environment Programme state that the current commitments under the Paris Agreement only cover 1/3 of the required emission reductions needed by 2030. And estimates by the International Energy Agency say that by 2100, going with the current climate commitments, this is where we will end up, with an average temperature increase of 2.7 degrees. Now, what needs to be done in terms of investments then, if we want to achieve the 2-degree scenario? Let's see. Okay, too fast in clicking. So globally, the additional investment requirement is, and you're free to calculate or count the zeros, it's $48 trillion as a cumulative amount needed in additional investments by the year 2060. Now it's a significant number, but if you break that down, it's only approximately 0.4 of the cumulative GDP globally during the same period of time. So in that context, it doesn't sound just as scary of a number. And yesterday evening, we talked about how much climate investments would cost if we would look at them per capita. And I actually did a quick calculation last evening, and based on that, this cost spread over the time period per capita would be approximately $167 per capita annually. Again, doesn't sound as scary then. If we look at where these investments need to be made, in which sectors, approximately half of this amount is within the power sector, and then followed by transport and buildings with approximately equal amounts. So what about the Nordics? We think we are really advanced in climate targets in the Nordics. And if we look at current commitments and what needs to be done in order to achieve a carbon neutral scenario, and this is now by the year 2050. These are 2-year-old estimates. We just heard earlier today that Sweden is targeting carbon neutrality by 2045. So this might not be correct as of today. But the additional amount is $300 billion over the period up until 2050. And that's to achieve the carbon neutral scenario, which means an 85% reduction in emissions, and assuming that the remaining 15% of the emissions are offset. Again, if we put this number into a perspective, it's less than 1% of the cumulative GDP in the Nordics over that period of time, and it means a 10% cost increase compared to the current climate targets. So 10% extra investments, you go one step forward to a carbon neutral scenario. And then the calculation per capita. For the Nordics, it's slightly higher. It would be $340 per capita and year. Then I want to add that achieving ambitious climate targets, it's not only about adding costs. You should also, in this context, consider what savings you can achieve. Beyond the obvious climate change benefits, you can also have significant savings in terms of fuel costs, increased energy security, and also reduced health-related costs connected to air pollution. Now, as an example for the Nordic region, this 300 billion euros could roughly be offset by what you save in health costs connected to air pollution. So that's worthwhile thinking about. Then if we look at different sectors in the Nordics and how much they contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions, you can see that decarbonization has been fastest for buildings and power and heat. For the building sector, the obvious reason is that we have a district heating system that has been well expanded. And for the power and heat sector, you can just say that actually the carbon intensity of the Nordic power sector is where the world needs to be in 30 years' time. So we're ahead in that area. And this is thanks to the expansion of renewable energy, but also the interconnected electricity grid, where we have the possibility to help each other and combine hydropower, stabilizing the more intermittent energy supply. The most challenging sectors in the Nordic aspect are industry, which is approximately 28% of the total emissions, and then the transport sector, which is approximately 40% of the emissions. And by 2050, you see what the end result should be for these sectors. Then if we look at the total investments needed, not only to achieve the current climate commitments, but also going that one step forward to a carbon neutral scenario, here you see how those costs would be split between sectors. And it's easy to see that the transport sector needs the highest volumes of investments. We could flip this around and talk about what sectors need to have increased investments proportionally compared to how much is invested today. And then the picture would be different. Then buildings and industry would rise far above the transport sector. So as a summary, the financial sector is in key position to enable the transition towards a 2-degree scenario. And that's basically why we are here today.
Yes, so how are we going to tackle this challenge and the need for finance? Well, institutions such as NIB, the Nordic Investment Bank, could provide at least part of the solution. NIB, we are an international financial institution, and other IFIs that you might have heard of is the World Bank, the IMF, or the Inter-American Development Bank. An IFI is normally owned and governed by nations, and this is also the case of NIB. We're owned by the Nordic and Baltic states. We were founded some 40 years ago, and our Baltic friends joined in 2005. So everyone here from a Nordic or Baltic country is an indirect owner of NIB. We have a AAA rating in creditworthiness with the major rating agencies. And that means that we hold the highest possible rating in creditworthiness. Examples of other AAA rated entities are the Kingdom of Sweden or the City of Stockholm. This also means that we fund ourselves cheaply on the international markets, which is key to our business. We have one single product, and that is a long-term investment loan. That product can be adapted according to the client needs. We work as a long-term complement to the commercial banks with whom we gladly cooperate. This is also one of the reasons why we only finance up to 50% of any project that we find interesting. We always leave space for other investors or lenders. And when we say long-term, they can be as long as 20 or 25 or even 30 years long, depending on the counterparty. And last year, we paid out some 3.1 billion euro in loans. That's approximately 32 billion Swedish kronor. We don't only hand out money, we also want to know what the funds will be used for. And we don't receive subsidies of funds from our owner states, it's rather the other way around. We are a profitable institution who pays dividends. We provide loans both to the private and public sector. The division is approximately 50-50. We're divided into 4 different business sector groups, depending on the type of industry which we finance, and that gives us a deeper understanding of what we are financing.
Now, we are a mandate-driven bank. It means that we have a clearly defined mission, what we are to achieve with our investments. And that is to invest in projects that either provide productivity gains or environmental benefits, and specifically for our member countries. As we are a long-term financier, sustainability risks are important for us to assess with any project we finance. That means that we have a sustainability review conducted on each and every investment. So we try to identify if there are any possible issues that in the long term could comprise a credit risk or a reputational risk or a risk for stranded assets. Now, we consider us to be also a developer of green standards. This is something we do in collaboration with other international institutions, trying to drive sustainability work forward and simply harmonizing standards. We are also the largest issuer of green bonds in the Nordic region, or environmental bonds, as we choose to call them. And by now, we have issued approximately 3 billion euros in green bonds. And the proceeds that we have collected from these green bonds have been used to finance selected investment projects that provide significant environmental benefits. Now, this is our investment process in kind of a nutshell. Our vision is a prosperous and sustainable Nordic-Baltic region, and that translates into the mission I just presented to you. We have, for our mission, identified some main drivers on the productivity side, as you see there on the right-hand side, and for the environment, what we want to achieve in our mission. And if we talk a little bit about the environmental drivers, the pollution reduction, resource efficiency, climate change mitigation, those are quite focused on achieving impacts, while the preventive measure is more about maintaining relevant infrastructure in a sustainable society. So for example, strengthening electricity grids, having stormwater control in place, and such things. Investments that do not necessarily provide an immediate impact, which is measurable. Then if we look at the two mandates we have, productivity and environment, those are equally important for us. Of course, we would like to invest only in projects that provide us both benefits on both sides, but a mandate on either side is sufficient for us. It says there that we analyze impact, and that's really important for us. When we do our analysis, we look at both qualitative and quantitative benefits of a project, and we try to weigh in all impacts of the project. So looking at negative aspects and the positive aspects, and then trying to find out what the net benefit of the project is. We also try to quantify and report the impact. Now, why is this so important for us? It's simply because impact, or the achieved impact of projects, plays an important role in our decision to finance. And if you look at the financial world in general, there is increasing demand that you actually report what you achieve. So you need to report back on the impact. As an example, our investors want to know what they get by investing in our environmental bonds. What do they get in terms of impact? And ultimately, impact reporting is a way of proving what you achieve, instead of just saying, trust me, this is a green project, actually showing the numbers. Now, after we have made an investment decision and the project has been implemented, we have a procedure in place to go back approximately 3 years after project implementation, go back to the client and ask, how did it go? We anticipated this impact. Did it go according to plan, or did something happen? And that's a way for us to also improve our own internal assessment systems, to see how well we have been able to assess the impact before project implementation. Local and global knowledge transfer. As we finance projects internationally, we have a good possibility to actually transfer knowledge, industrial competence, and best practices, especially within our member countries, but also globally. As an example, we do not only invest in climate change mitigation projects within our member countries, but also in clean tech development that may take place in our member countries, but can then be exported out to the world and ultimately, hopefully, have a global impact. We also cooperate internationally with other institutions. As an example, NIB was an observer in the EU high-level expert group on sustainable finance that was set up to provide a roadmap for how to consider sustainability issues in financial sector rules. And you may know that the EU Commission has actually recently submitted some legislative proposals that was based on the results of this work. Another forum where we have been active is the Green Bond Principles. And that's a network that sets standards for green bonds in general, trying to harmonize the procedures, and also does quite a lot of work on how to do impact reporting for the bonds. Cooperation with other international financial institutions is also important for us. We try to harmonize how we do sustainability work together with them. So again, setting standards, and examples of this cooperation is standards for greenhouse gas accounting, how do you do the calculations, and also cooperation on impact reporting. Then we also have some examples on local or more local cooperation with different institutions with whom we do different types of research projects.
So what type of projects do we finance? We have a quite broad mix. Not all our loans go to our member countries. Some 20% go to projects worldwide where there is a Nordic link or a Nordic content. And while we are divided into 4 different sector groups, we find climate-related investments basically in all those sectors in some way or another. In the ideal situation, we may use our financing as an incentive for the client to sharpen their environmental ambitions. There is also a financial logic behind this. Companies that have a good management on environmental issues often have a good financial order as well. There is a correlation. And also on the other way around, environmental sub-performers may have problems that in the long run turn into legal and financial liabilities. It's cheaper to have a proper conduct from the beginning rather than cleaning up afterwards. This is a good example of types of projects that we finance. A 100 million euro loan to enhance the energy efficiency in public and residential buildings in Lithuania. Many things can be said about energy efficiency. For instance, it's the greenest kilowatt hour is the one that's never needed or nor wasted. And while the climate impact of the building sector has decreased in our member region, there's still some disparities among the different countries. This 4.5 billion kronor loan to the city of Stockholm was the biggest in our bank history. We helped to finance the expansion of the Stockholm's largest sewage treatment plant. This infrastructure will help Stockholm to continue to grow and to stay a productive city. Emissions of pollutants and nutrients will decrease dramatically. Also, the emissions of microplastics will be greatly reduced. The biogas production will almost double, which will increase the amount of renewable fuel available in Stockholm. If you go to the restrooms during this event, you will enjoy the infrastructure of this client. Swedish real estate company Vasakronan has an ambitious strategy for energy and environment, so we're happy to support their projects with our lending. In Stockholm and Gothenburg, they are constructing 2 buildings according to the highest LEED certification. The building in Stockholm is located at Sergels Square, the very heart of the city, and these buildings will be used both for residential and commercial purposes. The building certification systems such as LEED can play an important role in assuring sustainability of the buildings, and it also makes our assessment easier. An example from an industry group. In Norway, we're happy to finance this new energy-efficient dairy plant for the Tine company in Norway. Tine are replacing an old plant with a more modern and efficient solution that will decrease the electricity use with 40%, and the plant will also have solar panels on the roof. Also here in Stockholm, we are financing the new CHP plant, co-owned between Fortum and the city of Stockholm. This CHP is using 100% renewable biomass as fuel and provides heat to the citizens and power to the grid. In total, we financed this project with 2 billion kronor. As mentioned earlier, district heating has helped to reduce the climate impact from the building sector in the Nordics. An example from our hometown of NIB in Helsinki, where we provided loan to purchase new trams. This is also a good example of a project that we'd like to finance that strengthen the public transportation systems with vehicles that are free from emissions. As we saw earlier, in the Nordics and in Sweden, the transport sector is one with the highest emissions and with the highest investment needs. So in this sense, this is a climate investment. Another small but important example, loan to SKF that we provided some years ago. It was an R&D project where, among other improvements, SKF reduced the friction of their ball bearings, so improved the energy efficiency. SKF ball bearings are used continuously in millions of places all the time, in engines, in vehicles, in household appliances, in machines around the world. So it's small to calculate the total impact of this research, but a small improvement in a small component has a vast benefit when used in millions of applications.
Yes. Thank you. Lena, you would like to round up for a last minute?
Well, I can just round up by showing that we have actually measured our impact of the financing. So these are examples from our environmental bonds, what impact has been achieved by those. You're missing the CO2 number. So here it comes.
Great. Thanks a lot. And since your vice president will be part of the final panel and save some reasonable amount of time for that, I think I save any questions for Thomas. And thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
So then, can I please have all our presentations on stage for a final, as well. And there is Thomas. Great. Yeah, there are microphones there.
Shuffle up, otherwise we won't fit in.
Yeah, please. And you should. Well, great. Well, let's start maybe in the overall, the greater picture. We were reminded about the Paris Agreement, that we are not exactly on track as the global community. So I wonder to each of you on the country level, do you consider the existing goals and pathways in line with the 2 or even 1.5 degree target, or is there discussion, as we heard in China, now stepping up into the next NDCs to come? Or how is the national discussion respectively in relation to Paris to these strategies? Anyone like to start? John, please.
So there is a special report on the 1.5 target due from the IPCC later this year. In our case, we've been doing some parallel work looking at whether the current target for an 80% reduction by 2050 should be maintained or increased.
Yeah.
We are therefore doing our own work on the UK's position. We'll wait till the IPCC report comes out. We'll combine those two and then we'll take a decision whether it is achievable and credible to make a change in the target to go forward. But at the moment, I think it remains an ambition, but we don't have the information to turn it into a specific target to which we can formally commit.
Yeah. Jeremy, is there a similar discussion in Berlin, or?
Yes, we have, as I said, so many discussions on targets.
Yeah.
That must be some hobby of politicians. The more targets, the better. But we really have a huge gap of instruments, and that's the thing I would like to claim, to get a little bit more honesty in really what can be achievable and what needs to be done now. There's a lot of robust things we have to do now. There's foreseeable things we can start now to get at least close to it. And then there can be more, but if we don't do anything today, we are so far from being anything beyond 60% in our projections. That's why I would claim to start with the low-hanging fruits, start with widening the options, start with getting along with Power to X in the first steps, demonstration projects, all these robust things that we know that we have to start today.
Yeah.
And then there's some upward potential.
Yeah.
But don't stick only with targets.
Fair point. This important one. Still then, before moving on to that, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think from Canada's perspective, we're fairly new at the goals that have been put forward as part of the Paris Agreement, and we have a new government at the federal level that's trying to really move on this. They're very excited and wanting to achieve the targets. That said, like I pointed out in my presentation, there are some concerns or issues at the provincial level, and that said, we can move beyond our target based on how much the provinces respond to their own internal climate change goals as well. So we have the Pan-Canadian framework, which I think will lead us to close to the goal, and then we have additional provincial actions which could move us beyond that. So,
and anything to add from the?
Well, I'll just quickly add that for us as this policy researcher, you know, I'm worried about 2, much less about 1.5. So having said that, I think the attention much more need to be on the really the emerging and the developing world. For example, just throw out one example. We've been closely watching major initiatives like the Belt and the Road initiatives in China. You know, this is arguably one of those gigantic infrastructure development that laid out in a region. You still have per capita carbon emission is really low for most of countries. If those developments repeat, even in a fraction of the way we done things in the past, and then we basically, you know, all the effort in other parts of the world, you know, wouldn't make much difference. So I really think the attention urgently need to be in those areas when major infrastructure development or the development in general is still happening, to make sure we bend the curve in those places.
And Thomas, you're then financing this real action on the ground in infrastructure and others. We could hear that you make sustainability analysis from a risk perspective, of course. But is there also a strategic evaluation? Like, is this a project that actually could be part of a zero net emission strategy, or do you make that kind of considerations?
No, absolutely. For every project, we look into those effects on that project. What we don't do, and that's why it's so fantastically interesting to be here, to look at the macro perspective. I mean, we can add up the figures for our portfolio and what we are doing, but we don't add up the totality of it and see what others are doing. So it's important for us to be part in those discussions and be in those meetings and listen to what's happening and see what others are doing. I think it's one interesting aspect that I was into a seminar last week in Tallinn was about how you compare what different countries are doing, and you take the best available technology, and you see what that would lead to in all the other countries. If the best countries' ideas would be implemented in other countries, it's quite large effects actually. So that's why it's so important to be together and listen to what the other countries are doing.
Yeah. Following up on the point made by Kirsten, I think you all more or less went into industrial policy or maximizing the benefits of UK industry or in different ways. Is that a narrative that is kind of broadly embraced in your national discussion, that this is more an opportunity than a threat, and where do you see the keys to make that private policy kind of bounding as strong as possible? Anyone, please.
Well, I think that's part of the discussion already, to see the chances of the investment chances for industry as well in a strategy that really combines the climate policy needs and the industrial chances for a country like Germany. And that's well understood, and the broader the level playing field is, the higher the chances are, obviously, as there's not only a national market but other markets out. And second, there is not the leakage issue, which is, at least for the very energy intensive issues, of course, one of the big threats that we have to cope with somehow, as long as the different achievements are different all over the globe. That's well understood. Still, it is sometimes neglected, at least when it comes to policy action. Not that much from today's perspective, what is on the table, but from the long-term perspective. An investment taken today needs a long-term perspective and quite safe conditions. And as we talk that much about all the exemptions and special treatments, every second year there is no long-term perspective for additional investment, and that's something investors would wish to see. Okay, so kind of ambitious policy is fine as long as it's long-term and foreseeable. Is that right? Yeah, simply fine enough. Amy, Canadian.
I would echo Kirsten's comment that certainty is big for industry, especially on the climate side. I think that what you see is there's a lot of the larger emitters would probably like to see are willing to and able to maybe make emissions reductions. They need to see it. They need to see that long-term strategy laid out so that they're not caught in a whipsaw on their investment side. That they do stuff and then it turns out that they're either trade exposed and nobody else is. You've got somebody else gets a special treatment because they didn't do an action or whatever. And so I think having that grand goal needs to be put in place so that everybody is going in the same direction. Everyone sees the same rules in place.
John, I think in Sweden for a long time we were a bit hesitant if we really needed a climate law, or we were achieving our targets and things were. But I think one point that came through and was about increasing this foreseeability and kind of institutionalize the climate policy a bit. Is that also how it's worked and perceived in UK, or from an industrial perspective?
Yeah, I think if you go into dialogue with those involved in the industry or the financing sector, the message that comes back is what they would most appreciate is certainty about the future. Now, of course, all industries want certainty, and it doesn't exist. But I think consistency of policy to enable people to work out where to go is really the key to this. And just picking up the earlier points, I think if you look in the energy sector, we've seen that as a result of investment policies, particularly in the UK, but also in Germany and Denmark and in other places, we're now seeing wind energy systems becoming subsidy-free competitive with conventional systems.
Yeah.
And that is a really important point, because the narrative about these strategies is the fact, and I mean, Carsten, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in both the UK and Germany, there is a political awareness that they can no longer carry on subsidizing these things, that there has to be a genuine economic benefit. So I think certainty of direction is one key element of that. The application of innovation and technology is another. But overall, there is the ongoing political commitment to the direction, and then the engagement of the other stakeholders to say, right, that is where we're going, but we've got to turn this into an economic success story. And that's why the financing industry is increasingly becoming involved in green products and bonds and structures.
And I guess even if you reminded us about the challenges of the maybe coal peak in China, I guess from an industrial perspective you are investing in this.
I think I very much second that. If it's only add on in China, it's not only those consistency, the clarity of the policy, be that long-term or near-term, but it's also increasingly, I feel, what is urgent is the race of time. For example, in China, I'll give you one simple example. The Hebei province has been suffering with this restructuring because they have heavy steel dominated structure. This is in every sense, from the industry, from the local economy, and so all that. The vision, strategy, everybody has a consensus on this. This needs to be done. But the question is, it cannot be done within the time frame that everybody hoped. And it's that time difference, and again, applied to the scale of China or applied to any other emerging economies will, in my view, make the difference. Is we know, we all strong consensus where we're going. And the growth story, the narrative shift is so clear. But it's just how fast we're getting there. I think the acceleration is the key.
So even mature economists, then we should get some of the Chinese pace in transformation.
Makes a whole lot of difference.
Good. Just a very quick addition to that. One of the interesting factors in China has been the dramatic increase in public awareness of air quality issues, which has led to support for health reasons of policies that were being derived for climate reasons originally. And that's proved a very powerful combination.
And I guess also what the previous US administration used actually to that some kind of arguments to increase their ambition on the climate side. Yeah, okay. We should invite some questions, short, clear questions or comments from the audience. Anyone? And when you speak, yeah, you need to use your microphone, which should be just on your side of your chair. Yeah, because then you can also be heard, or your neighbor's chair. Yeah, great. To be heard also through the live stream. Please. There is a red button. Oh, even better.
My name is Fabian Midman. I'm an analyst on international relations. I remember very well after the tsunami in Japan how Chancellor Merkel decided that no more nuclear energy. And she did it for security reasons, societal security. How much investment in your projects is reserved for security? And when it comes to infrastructural projects, there is also another type of security. Is this included in your calculations? Because this is really a matter that touches all of us. Thank you.
Thanks. On the security perspective, I think we can take one or two more questions, and then we'll bunch a bit to get. Yeah, please, Elisa.
Several of you have mentioned carbon capture.
Yeah. Now it should work.
Several of you have mentioned carbon capture and storage, but in reality, not so much has happened at this just now. In Germany, you talk about acceptance. In England, it's a little bit another situation. What is your comment regarding the future of CCS? Is it a huge possibility, or is it not what we wish it should be?
Yeah. Thanks. We bring in one more. We have the security perspective, carbon and storage, and please.
So, Maria Sankovic, I'm from Swedish Smart Grid Forum. My question is on, thank you very much for your very good presentation and comprehensive plans and strategy I heard about. One question is that I think you will need individuals and companies to be engaged in this transition. So what kind of measures you have in your countries to make this happen?
Great. Now if we can keep all this on the security perspective, carbon capture and storage, and then involvement of actors. Anyone wants to pick on?
Maybe we can start on the micro perspective. Because in NIB we have nuclear on the exclusion list. We don't do nuclear now, new plants and so forth. There's of course this debate where nuclear is in this whole scope. In NIB we don't do it, but we do if it is a security aspect for the nuclear station, then we can actually finance it. So that's a carve-out from the carve-out, so to say. But generally on predictability, I just want to mention that is, of course, I mean that's evident for a bank. That's key. We can only finance project if the political scenario is stable and predictable, and the project therefore bankable.
That's what you like, yeah. Carsten, since Germany was referred to.
And what we need.
Yeah, maybe three brief answers. The first one to Ms. Nielsen. Yes, CCS, it is not just a possibility. I think it is a necessity once you really want to formulate very ambitious goals. So it's more a question addressing politicians to take leadership in also addressing issues that are not that easy to communicate and to start. It's not that much about R&D. I think there's projects all over the world has been there, but it is about really explaining that we need a broad range of technologies, including CCS, if we really want to go that far, and that's something some politicians are quite hesitant with. Policy measures, we are far from anything we need, at least in Germany, and the thing is that we can't really start with even the low-hanging fruits, and if I look at my abatement curve, all these energy efficiency in building things, which are very much on the left, are an issue for years to be discussed, and we're still waiting for the tax incentives and some policy achievements to get that started. The technologies are on the table. You can buy everything in the shop. It's just it is not feasible for the house owner to do it by himself. It needs an additional help, and it is economically feasible for an economy like Germany, but it needs some extra action, and we are far from that. Security of supply. I can't name a figure on the security cost to isolate that, but of course, everything we've modeled was to have an energy system which is as secure as today. I think with 12 minutes electricity loss per year, Germany is very much on top globally in terms of security of supply. Although we have those 37% volatile intermittent energies, and in some regions it is even double of that. So technically, I think we've proven to deal and to cope with all this volatility in the energy system, with flexibility in demand, with all the different pieces of the puzzle. If it's not that much on technology, I think it is more probably on really defining an energy system and the rules that makes that happen. And the energy system and the incentives needed will change. So the whole market design, that is something we have to work on, and we still are on that. Thanks.
Amy, anything you like to add on this?
Yeah, just a couple of things on the nuclear piece. Canada has, Ontario has reinvested a large amount of money in refurbishing their nuclear energy. It's a big part of their carbon-free plan, so that's something that we differ from, I guess, than in Europe. I think Ontario is the only province that has nuclear energy. In terms of stakeholder engagement, that's in getting Canada's climate plan put together. There was a tremendous amount of engagement with the industry and stakeholders. Canadians alone, there was a website where people could be involved. I mean, in Canada, we take stakeholder engagement with industry, individuals, and our Indigenous people very seriously. So that becomes a big part of how you get people on board with making the changes, is that everybody can understand both where they're the different perspectives, and then coming together with a strategy going forward. So yeah, and then carbon capture and storage. We have a carbon capture and storage plant in Saskatchewan. That's part of their big piece of their climate plan, or they're reducing emissions. That's part of the reason why they're not in favor of a carbon price, because they feel they're investing in the technology. That said, I haven't seen, there's lots of talk about carbon capture and storage, and I'd like to see more of it in order to understand what the barriers are to making that a reality, because I've heard about it in my 25-year career about carbon capture and storage being sort of the thing that's going to provide that kind of carbon free energy or carbon reduced energy, and I still have not seen it being replicated on a grand scale. So there's clearly barriers, and we need to understand what those are before we can sort of say that it's the technology that is going to solve the problem for globally.
Yeah. Okay. John or Han, anything?
Let me just briefly pick up the CCS. I think it's, and I'm speaking personally here, I think it's quite clear what the problem is with CCS. It's cost and risk. It's more costly than other processes, and in market-based systems, there's the risk of who will take the liability for a store of CO2 that you intend to leave there for thousands of years. And somebody's got to take the liability ultimately, and it'll have to be governments, and they're still getting their act together on that. One of the issues about current CCS plants is many of them don't actually do the S part, in that they capture the carbon, then they use it very often for enhanced oil recovery, and half of it comes back out of the hole again. So that's one thing there. Very quickly, on the security nuclear side, certainly the view from where I come from is that security is best ensured by diversity of supply and diversity of sources of supply, rather than by going for one particular technology. The reason the UK is going to maintain its nuclear, and in fact develop its nuclear facility, is nothing to do with security. It's actually to do with the engineering constraints of managing the energy system, and the option of additional sources of energy that could be used not just as electricity, but potentially with the next generation nuclear plants, the high temperature thermal energy that can also be used as part of an integrated hydrogen scheme and things of that form. So there are reasons there. And finally, stakeholder engagement. That is the one thing that we don't have a credible plan for at the moment. I'm sorry to say that our efforts have confirmed the fact that if you simply shout louder and produce more evidence, it doesn't engage the stakeholders anymore. they actually need an emotive reason or a personal reason to become involved, and we've not yet really found what that is in the developed countries of the West, in my view.
Okay, before we closing hand,
yeah, just two sentences to add on that, what we're doing in terms of the individuals and the society. I think the second that in the Chinese concept, I think in terms of national policies, I couldn't pinpoint any, but what is worth to point out is China's growing middle class is something that is increasing the attention of many. Because I don't need to explain, you can see the vital importance of capturing this transition as the middle class is rising, is increasing, and shaping that so-called identity of that middle class in terms of the lifestyles, consumptions, and so that. You know, we're study that, and the government is also taking note of that. One indication is something under the China Council for International Cooperation on the Environment and Development this year has a task force, is particularly on that sustainable lifestyle and sustainable social governance. It's actually co-chaired by Åsa Ramsson here in Sweden. So that would be the project that goes for a year, and hopefully give some recommendations to the Chinese government.
Thank you. I'm sure there could be 100 more questions to continue these discussions, but we'll try to keep to the schedule. And I would like to thank you a lot for extremely interesting presentations. And I'm sure you have given us, the audience here, is with both this sense that we're all in the same boat. It's the same basic challenge and we share it. But also that there are differences and we have to build up on what resources or our technological, social, or economic contexts in finding the pathways forward. But you can always learn and pick things from there. And that's where I would like to round up, to ask each one of you being here this morning then to share just for some short word, a 30-second one on what you have picked up from the other presentations, or what has been as an encouraging thing that you can carry with you back home on the plane or discuss with colleagues when you are back. Anyone? Thomas?
Let me start. I mean, I think it's always totally interesting to see the different angles and the different angle of the presentations, but the underlying importance and the fact is still the same.
Yeah.
And that strikes me. Yeah, I think that's what I would like to say.
Yeah. Anyone? Carsten?
Well, I'm not into the details. Of course, every country is different.
Yeah.
Scandinavia more with biomass. My key learning is that there's different motivations to do things. Europe very much really from the climate policy side. There's other places, as China, probably more from industry development side. There or from local emissions or from energy dependence as in North America. So there's different trends that might work in a similar direction. What is quite clear, we need closer cooperation. I've mentioned the example of Power to X. That's nothing one of us can achieve alone. And if there is oil or gas exporting countries who want to have a future in their business, that's something that's on the table to develop this together. And I'm still looking for some instrument to bring this together. I don't have the solution, but I see the need. And I'm just questioning how can we bring the investors and all those under one framework together to make this investment happen, because it is needed, that's clear.
Great, we put that on the list for next phase of the project, Elisabeth. Anyone? John? Yeah.
So I think I'd say three things that have been reinforced for me. The first is I'm delighted that we have moved from what used to be the assertion we can do this, you just need to do this and it's possible, to a stage where everybody's recognizing how big a change this is. And not that it is not possible, but this is a major task that we need to address. Secondly, from what everybody said, I think the different natures of the challenges in different jurisdictions have come out quite clearly, and the fact that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's
There's a portfolio of different approaches that need to be deployed at different rates in different areas to meet the needs. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing that I'm really pleased to see is that there are different ideas in different areas about how this can be done. And I'm going to go away reinforced in the fact I have no guilt at copying your good ideas.
Great.
Now, I may sound like a broken record now, and to me is seeing all those examples, and for one thing, I do feel that common journey, that direction, that structure is largely we're consistent, although the contexts are different, the challenges are there. But it's the pace of that journey, it's the acceleration, and I really think that's where we cannot just talk about 2050. We need to have things to be done 2025. And otherwise, we will not have chance for 2050.
Amy, we'll have the final word.
Just really quickly, it was really interesting to hear. Well, first of all, the dialogue is now beyond, should we do something, and what could we take and when to, we need to take actions and we need to do it now, and sort of the all of the above scenario where we're doing something on every aspect is really fascinating, is really interesting to me. That transportation was a common theme that everybody brought forward as being an issue that they felt like was one of the big areas that they needed to address, and the fact that we now have ZEVs may mean that we're going to be able to make giant strides in that sector, that portion of our economy that is carbonized right now. And then finally, just, bringing forward on the international side, not only just the developed countries, but what I feel is we need to bring along the lesser developed countries to get those where we could see massive emissions reductions by implementing existing technologies now, which we haven't really talked about, but it's one of the things that I feel like we should really move towards.
Super. So following on that, I think we should not spend any seconds more of talking this morning. Rather, thank you all that came and everyone listening through the live stream, and then we will just all continue and go away from here and start this great acceleration.
Don't go away from here. There is lunch.
There is lunch
yes,
for everyone?
Yes, it's a lunch upstairs. A lot of food probably. So stay here and continue talking.
Okay, we'll allow you lunch, and then we start the great acceleration. Thanks a lot.
Please. And thank you all. And thank you, Ola, for done a very great job here this morning. So this is a small present for all of you.
Okay.
This is for you. Thank you very much. And all of you get lunch. Thank you. To remember Eva.
Great.